All right, good evening and welcome to the next episode of Couch Caucus. And tonight we have a special guest. We have Rebecca Terk with us from Dakota Rural Action, and we're going to be focusing a whole lot on bills that impact small farmers, environmental issues, conservation, water quality, all those things that are important to everybody in South Dakota. And I'm going to hand it directly off to Rebecca to tell us a little bit about DRA and the work that you do. And then we'll just kind of jump into what the main bills that you're wanting people to know about and how we can advocate.
Great. Thanks, Bree. Thanks, Amanda. I'm like Bree said, my name is Rebecca Terk. I am a staff organizer, senior organizer, and the lobbyist for Dakota Rural Action. We are a 30-plus-year-old nonprofit based here in South Dakota, and we have membership across the state. We focus on food, ag, environment, energy issues. We also focus on some issues related to democracy, particularly around the initiative and referendum process. Dakota Rural Action is an organization that has for many, many years had a full-time lobbyist in Pierre during the legislative session. This session, with the situation with COVID, I am actually working from home, lobbying remotely, rather than moving to Pierre, which is unfortunate because I don't get to see some of the folks there that I really appreciate seeing during the session, the good citizens of Pierre. So, like I said, lobbying remotely. I'm based in Rapid City. Otherwise, I've been on both sides of the state, lived in South Dakota now going on 27 years, moved from my home state of Vermont back when I was 20 years old. Really focused on, this session in particular. There's just a broad range of bills, and there are really quite often. I mean, the thing about Dakota Rural Action, because we do work on so many issues related to, food, ag, energy, environment, and democracy, it really is a full-time job during the legislative session to track everything. I think right now I have something like 47 bills on my watch list. Not all we're going to actually engage in, but watching them. Of course, there's a whole bunch of Caucus or vehicle or hog house bills, that we're kind of watching to see, what kind of language is going to be inserted there. I'm not sure, how familiar your viewership is with those bills, but I'm assuming if they're watching the show, they probably have a sense of, all the strangeness that can happen during the session. So, I don't know if there's anything more you want me to throw in before I jump in.
No, we'll just go ahead and dive right into some questions. It's really helpful to know more about how broad your scope is in terms of what you are advocating for. And so what I do want to make sure is that people know how they can get involved. So maybe just before you dive into the first bill, I did put the website to your organization in the comments, so that'll show up on Facebook and on YouTube. Obviously, it's a membership organization too. People can join as members. What are some other ways that people can get involved with the organization and support your work?
Thanks for that question, Bree. So Dakota Rural Action is a member-led organization, which means that our, stances on issues are, kind of put together, formulated, talked about, discussed among our membership. We have several committees that I'm working with right now. Of course, we have a legislative committee that I just met with about an hour and a half ago to talk about all the bills that are on our list and where they're at and kind of actions. But we also have committees related to, community energy development, which is sort of like, how do we advance, really community-based green energy solutions, looking toward our future generations. We have a Rural Vitality Committee that works on issues related to, big ag, confined animal feeding operations, issues, that are primarily East River, but really moving west, as we've seen in the last few years. We have a pipeline committee. Of course, Dakota Rural Action has, for over a decade, fought the Keystone XL pipeline in order to protect our water, and also in order to protect the rights of landowners, who are being forced into easement contracts with that company, as well as recognizing, our indigenous communities and the threats they face, with missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, and and relatives at large related to these man camps, and just overarching. I think a lot of our work is really related to future generations, how we can build a better life, not only for current generations, but for our children and grandchildren. And a lot of that is related to our work on, keeping the water safe, and protecting our water resources. You can get involved with Dakota Rural Action. You can join Dakota Rural Action, become a member by, going to our website, dakotarural.org, which is in the comments, and then there's a join piece there. We also have geographic chapters, so they're focused and working on issues in particular geographic areas. I staff the Black Hills chapter. I've staffed some East River chapters when I lived there. I've staffed the Pierre chapter when I was active there as well. So, and different chapters, can kind of choose to focus on specific issues. And of course, in the Black Hills, a lot of our work is related to issues around mining, uranium and gold mining, and protecting our water from the toxic impacts of those activities. But certainly statewide, we work on local foods issues, farm to school, training, beginning farmers, and lots of other issues. So, it's interesting to me, I will say, as a lobbyist for an organization like DRA, which I'm really passionate about and have been a member of for much, much longer than I've actually worked here, is that the lobbyist position, because of the breadth of the issues that we work on, is really have to know enough to be a little more than enough to be dangerous on a lot of different issues, and I certainly don't profess to be an expert on many of them, but we that's where I rely on the expertise of our members. I certainly could not speak on these issues as well as I do without the support of our members. And part of my job, a big part of my job as a lobbyist for DRA, is to encourage our members to participate in the process, to testify on bills, to lend their expertise to the government process, and to hopefully make better decisions that way. So, bills. I have a few that I brought here tonight, and Bree and I had a little bit of discussion about them ahead of time. So I will just, I guess, launch into the first one. And that is House Bill 1028. So one thing that I think viewers should know is that all of the water in the state of South Dakota belongs to the people of South Dakota. Okay, so we own the water of this state. And the water rights program of the DENR It's still the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. We have not merged quite yet with the Department of Ag. Their job is really to steward that resource for the people of the state. And so the Water Rights Program takes in applications for water appropriation permits. So people who are requesting water for industrial projects, for irrigation wells, municipalities who are looking at, putting in a new well to, to supply the domestic, use of their citizens. And there are some criteria that that the Water Rights Program uses to decide whether or not to grant that permit. There's 4 of them, and they are that, okay, there's water, there's unappropriated water that, we can give you, we can say yes, that giving you that water doesn't adversely impact other users, other, currently permitted users, downstream users, etc. The third criteria is that, the project that's applying for the water, that's asking for the water, is a beneficial use of the water. What they're going to do with that water is beneficial. And that the fourth thing is it's in the public interest for them to give you that water that you're asking for. What House Bill 1028 does is it says that people who want to challenge, someone applying for a water appropriation permit for a project, people who want to challenge that project have to be uniquely injured in some way in order to say, I want to intervene in this process. I want to be able to provide evidence. I want to be able to ask questions. They say that you have to have a unique personal kind of injury in order to be able to contest these water appropriation permits. So, we are seriously concerned about this, and here's why. So, first of all, you should know that most contested cases, most times when people say, no, you shouldn't have that water, it's one or two things. It's either that, your neighbor's worried that your new well is going to impact their old well. Okay. So it's a, kind of dispute among neighbors, which is generally speaking pretty easy to clear up. The other place where people contest water appropriation permits is where there are these huge projects, large scale projects with potentially large scale impacts to a lot of people, and not just people, but communities, animals, wildlife, plants, etc., that depend on that water. Okay. And those kinds of projects are, the Keystone XL pipeline, which crossed, was going to, before it was canceled, 9 counties in western South Dakota, where we like to fight about water. The Dewey Burdock in situ leach uranium mine in Custer and Fall River counties, where in order to do this process, they basically have to declare a whole aquifer off limits because they're going to re-inject wastewater into it. Mineral Mountain Resources, which is gold mining in sensitive areas of the hills, those kinds of projects where it's not a unique injury for any person in that area to say, I'm going to be adversely impacted. And so what 1028 does is say, well, you have to have a unique injury. You have to be able to, to really prove it in order to be able to bring a case before the board. And so DRA is fighting this issue, and we're recognizing too that, in terms of beneficial use of the water, what the DENR has been doing on this issue is that they've basically been saying, well, it's a beneficial use of the water if the corporation or the person or whoever's applying for the water, wants it. Like, if they want to use it, then it's beneficial to them, so it's beneficial. Well, we don't necessarily agree with that. And the idea that it's in the public interest, is another question that is a broad question, right? I mean, like, for example, a water permit that we contested relating to supplying water to Keystone XL Pipeline man camps. Now you can say, well, it's in the public interest because, there's going to be a whole bunch of dudes, using water in a big, trailer house camp, on the middle of the prairie. And that's great because we bring in these jobs temporarily, over maybe, a year, 18 months. But is it in the public interest if, we have the Department of Justice actually, providing grants to our, domestic violence and sexual assault related, organizations, because they know that bringing in this man camp is going to result in more women being raped and assaulted, and more people being trafficked, and more violence in the communities. Is that in the public interest? Is that a beneficial use of the water? What the DENR Water Rights Program, testified to in committee was, this is a frivolous issue and it's outside of our, scope of consideration. We don't consider that outside of the scope of consideration. If we're talking about a beneficial use, if we're talking about public interest, we have to talk about all of the reasons, for this project going forward, and what giving this water to the project means in terms of our communities, in terms of potential impacts to the water, in terms of, potential impacts to people. So this is one that's moving forward. It is, in the comments, it's being heard in Senate Ag and Natural Resources on February 9th. And we're really urging folks to, to communicate with their legislators that, this is not, this is not a good change. This does not increase transparency or accountability to the people. And that, to remind folks, the water of South Dakota belongs to the people of South Dakota, and the people should have a say in how it's used. So that's my spiel on 1028, and I hope folks will, will really consider that, because, this basically pushes people out. It pushes people and organizations out who are really looking at long-term impacts of these projects beyond, a year or two of a big spike and, a bunch of people coming in and having jobs, but like, what's the long-term impact in our communities? So yeah, I don't know if you have any questions.
Yeah, I am actually curious about this in terms of, and I was trying to find the bill and I don't see it now, but it's interesting too, because some of these bills get worded in a certain way where then you can't search for it for the terms that you would think you would find it under. So for example, when I typed in water permit, nothing shows up. So you have to type in certain things. So I mean, just thinking about, in my mind, what this bill clearly is saying is that it's legislation that's in the favor of the company or the people wanting to extract a natural resource and need access to water to do that, or to extract water, even in terms of thinking about water rights as we move forward into like climate change and droughts and everything else. That I think that is another piece of this too. But certainly, like the issues with mining in particular in the Black Hills is what I was thinking about, especially having recently moved from the Black Hills to Pierre. But I'd recently heard that there, and I don't know if any legislation was brought forward on this, but that there was discussion about, was it an oil rig or something that's up in the northwest corner of the state somewhere, and they were going to be capping them, and so there was like a permit request to go back in and use it, and so it was this push to say, well, you might as well allow that permitting before it gets capped, because then that's just more work later on. And I'm not sure if anything ever came of that, because that was before session started. And I'm not sure if it was up near Lemon somewhere. Anyway, that I thought about that too, because certainly that ties in with all of the water rights and access in terms of thinking about fossil fuels in particular, and access to water. But could you talk a little bit more too about what's going on in Edgemont? Like, what's the status of that?
So, okay, this is, we've actually had, so you're referring to Edgemont, and when you're talking about Edgemont, I assume you're referring to like Dewey Burdock and the PowerTech Azarga, in situ leach uranium mine project. And that has actually been, we've been fighting that for years. We recently moved the Rapid City office of Dakota Rural Action. We just moved down the hall into a little bit larger space. And I was looking through a number of the materials for the initial water rights permit, the contested case hearing around water rights for this project in 2013. So this has been a number of years that this has been fought. Part of the issue, so right now it's kind of stalled, and part of the reason it's stalled is because there hasn't been adequate tribal consultation, because those lands are the unceded treaty territory of Oceti-Sakowin. So, and particularly the Oglala Lakota Nation is looking at, there needs to be adequate tribal consultation on this, and it hasn't been done. And COVID in particular has, created a situation that's made that more difficult. We definitely have concerns around that project because, so even though, with Biden's election, certainly, we were very pleased with the decision on the Keystone XL permit and rescinding that permit. However, the Democratic Party has put a pro nuclear power stance in their platform. And that's concerning for us here in South Dakota, not just in, the southwestern part of the state, but, more broadly, because, while nuclear power is, people point at it as a green energy, a clean energy, coming out of the stack, sure, but the mining process and then the waste disposal process is, some of the most toxic, kind of situations you can be looking at. And I know that in the past, many years, there's been discussion about allowing, nuclear waste to be, disposed of or stored in various counties in the state. Hawken County, Bon Homme County was actually, looked at as an actual, uranium mining area, but they were kind of forced out by local landowners. So, it's quite a bit more widespread than folks think, this issue. And so, that's something that I think, we really need to be watching for and looking at, in the coming years, because, the process of uranium mining and this in situ leach uranium mining, and we have, materials available, to kind of share with folks on that, is incredibly damaging and toxic to water. They basically have to, re-inject the wastewater from this process into an aquifer, which then cannot be used really for anything, for irrigation, for livestock, for people. It basically, it poisons and contaminates the water. And, particularly in the area of the hills where the geohydrology So that's the fancy word for water in rocks, right? Water in the ground, water, flowing around in the ground and in rocks. We have a lot of fracturing, which means that we have some really interesting movement of water that is not actually fully understood. It's been studied for years, not fully understood. There's, some great books about it, but in the end, we can't afford to be, poisoning our water for someone else's profit, for anyone's profit. And that's a really big concern for us, particularly with this. And of course, there are lots and lots of, I always thought this was funny when I moved out here. There's lots and lots of abandoned mom and pop uranium mines. Now, you don't feel like that's not a thing, right? It is a thing. And it's a thing not only down in the southwestern part of the state, but also the northwestern part of the state. So Hardin County and, and areas up in the northwestern part of the state, and in the Custer, National Forest, you have areas where there are actually signs up, hey, don't spend any time in here because we haven't fully reclaimed all this craziness that's gone on in terms of the, the mining of uranium, both, I guess, amateurs and professionals. So that's another issue that we're dealing with that I think a lot of folks just don't have a full grasp of. And frankly, the more I have a grasp of it, the more, my mind is just blown by some of the messes that have been left in this state, that corporations, and this is the issue with oil and gas development and Cedar Spyglass, which is the, uncapped gas wells that were leaking that taxpayers had to pay to cap, insufficient bonding, insufficient regulation, and just basically leaving it for taxpayers to clean up, or not, or just leaving it, so.
Yeah, I could go on and on with you about this, the uranium mining stuff, because I actually used to live on the Spokane Indian Reservation in Washington State, which is where there is a Superfund site from a former uranium mine called the Midnight Mine. And actually just a close friend of mine just passed away from a really rare form of uterine cancer that there was one, and there was even, it's super, super rare. And there was one other woman on the reservation who also had it. And so, and they think it's because of exposure, because they mined it. It was an open pit mine, and then they processed and milled it down the road in another town. And so, it's like all the trucks, just a lot of just a huge impact historically with that, even though it's been closed for a few decades. And I did a lot of work there with my students doing water sampling and checking intake into plants and macroinvertebrates and so on. And my in-laws live in Edgemont. So I'm really, really interested in this issue. And I'm going to talk with you more off camera about this, because there's something else knowing that there were mom and pop, you think about people, panning for gold, but I'm just trying to picture just into mom and pop people just hey, look, here's some yellow cake. Yay. So we'll have to talk about that more off camera, because there's actually another thing I am working on coming up in April that story would be really interesting for. So let's get back to the legislation piece. And actually, before I have you go on to the next bill, Amanda, do you have anything you want to say or questions you want to ask?
Yeah, so full disclosure, I'm a member of DRA, so I feel like I should tell people that so they also know my perspective. But one of the things, so for folks, and talking about the water bill is really interesting, and the fact that the water belongs to everybody in South Dakota. So for people who live in town and maybe think that this stuff doesn't apply to them, or that they would never be the person going to contest a water rights hearing, what kind of messaging, or just what do you say to those people to help them maybe realize why they should be writing their representative or senator about this issue?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Amanda, because, well, and I think, so I, I don't want to be getting into an East River, West River sort of fight here because I've spent most of my time in South Dakota. I've been East River. I've lived in the Vermilion area. I lived in Toronto for a couple of years. I actually lived in Mission for a couple of years, and now I live outside of Rapid City in rural Pennington County. But I look at this as, look, the water is connected, and I think and I wish this wasn't the case, but I think there's a lot more West River, and particularly around the hills. I think there's a lot more kind of consideration and concern for our water resources because we have less of it, right? And I heard this, and I actually said it in a committee hearing last week. But the Western perspective that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting, right? I mean, we are absolutely concerned about our water in the western part of the state, and and elsewhere. But the thing is that when your water is contaminated, and even look to Des Moines, and look to the Des Moines Waterworks case, where Des Moines Waterworks sued a number of watershed areas because of contamination of nitrates in their waterways, and recognizing that this contamination can lead to serious health impacts to people in the community, blue baby syndrome, and other kinds of health impacts. And the cost of taking those, the nutrient, right, because it's related to ag, and it's about growing crops. But when that gets into the water in large concentrations, you're looking at serious public health impacts. And in order to alleviate that, you're looking at serious costs. And when we get, so I mean, that's, East River perspective. Think about, the potential contamination of your water in that respect. West River, because we have more, of course, grassland, and less issues around, say, concentrated, and commodity production, right? And CAFOs, and the spreading of manure, but also the use of chemical fertilizer. Okay, well, West River, potentially we're looking at issues around, toxic impacts from mining, right? So the cyanide process for, gold mining, and issues with in situ leach uranium mining, where you have, potentially radioactive water as well as other chemicals in your water. If nothing else, if you're not worried about, like, chemical, contamination of your water, or potential fecal coliform or whatever else, you should be worried about the cost, because, our public water supply systems, our rural water districts, our municipal water districts, I mean, they have to clean the water to a certain standard in order to supply it. And, and the cost of doing that, goes up as you have, a higher contamination rate, right? But it's not just about people, right? It's also about, like, the fish. Do you like to fish? Do you like to, jump in the creek to cool off in the summer? I'm sorry, I said winter because I've been jumping in the creek once a month myself, even when it is cold, but most people don't do that. So, I think people need to really understand, and particularly with the impacts of climate change, water is a more and more precious commodity. I mean, water is life, and we need it to survive. Our livestock needs it to survive. Our children need it to survive. Our gardens, we would like to have clean water. So there are a lot of reasons to be, to be concerned about this. And, it's yours. You own it. If you're a resident of South Dakota, you own that water. You get to have a say. And if the use of that water impacts, your community, not only you, but your community broadly, you should have a right to say something about it. Not a lot of people participate in this process. I mean, it's very few water permits are contested. And I will tell you, going through the DENR's website, that I have not seen a permit denied since 2015, which means that this process, and this is what we found in the process. Yeah, we'd like them to deny some of these permits, but what we found in this process, around water appropriation permits, is that we have had an impact in terms of increasing the protections on our water. So saying you have to do real-time water monitoring. When you're pulling water from the Bad, the White, and the Cheyenne rivers, you have to monitor that real time. We have to be able to see, that you're not over, appropriating. So participation in this process is important. People's concerns are important because it's their water. We own it. It's our water. And we should have a right to participate in the process in a meaningful way. That's not just, hey, here's a comment that you can ignore, but here's actual evidence that, this could be a negative impact. And what are you going to do about it, Water Management Board, in terms of placing more stringent conditions on these permits? I mean, it'd be great if they would say no, but they don't say no. So, participating in this process is really about, further protections for our water. And we have, that has been a great piece of that process. And also just, putting it out to the public, and getting more people engaged and involved and interested in their water, protecting their water for themselves and future generations and their communities.
All right. So we're going to segue into the next bill.
Let's do that.
So the next bill, I mean, it's a whack-a-mole type life for the legislative session, I feel like, with all of these bills. But the next one that I wanted you to share with us about is the one that basically is trying to redefine the classification for agricultural land for taxation. And I think it would be helpful for people to know that, if they didn't know this already, that if your land is designated agricultural, whether you're a small acreage farm, like 1 to 3 acres, versus a massive, where you've got multiple quarters of land, which consists of hundreds of acres per quarter, I think, I don't know the exact math, but it's a lot of land, that you are not taxed the same way on that land as, say, somebody who owns a lot and a house in the city, or, so commercial residential land is taxed at a higher rate, basically, than agricultural land. And there's good reasons for that in terms of profitability and the ability for farmers to stay afloat. So can you give us some updates on this bill and what's the reasoning behind it and kind of where it's at?
Sure. Yeah. And, again, super wonky stuff, but I think really important in terms of our communities. So there's a difference between, so there's zoning. Zoning in counties is about like sort of what you can and can't do on the land. So when you say, you're in the ag zone district, there are things you can do. You can farm. You can also, have conditional uses, which are uses that like are allowed, but there's more strict criteria. There's a public hearing, things like, wind turbines, CAFOs, potentially like an ethanol plant, and other things like that, right? And then, of course, when you get into town and you have high density residential, and you have different things like that. But the way that, okay, so there's zoning, which says what you can and can't do, but there's assessment, which is how you're taxed. So right now there's basically 3 levels of taxation, or 3 kind of, classes. And those are ag, non-ag, and owner-occupied single family. I mean, those are kind of the basics, right? And you can be, say you're right on the outskirts of town. You have even a 3 or a 5 or a 7 acre parcel, and you are zoned as like, you're considered rural residential, right? Like, so you're being taxed like you're basically you're a homeowner and you have a big yard. But if you basically create from that land, you create a farm, and I will tell you, as a former CSA producer, truck farmer, like, you can produce a lot of food on even an acre, less than an acre, and some of these folks are producing like huge quantities of food. They're CSA, community supported agriculture farmers, where people can buy a share in the farm and get, a weekly delivery of produce. They're selling at the farmers markets in town, which means that they're, contributing to the municipal tax, intake, because they have to tax those and pay that tax to the state. It goes back to the municipality. So people are producing, they're farmers, they're small acreage farmers, okay? And they're producing food for their local communities. This bill, House Bill 1085, basically says that, okay, small producers, you may be classified, for taxation purposes. Those folks are often, for taxing purposes, they're classified as ag, because that's what they're doing, right? I mean, they are producing food, they're selling food, they're, and they're, of course, hopefully making a profit off selling agricultural products in their community. What this bill does is it says that if you hit a couple of different markers, we're going to kick you off that ag tax classification. If you are under 10 acres, if you have municipal utilities, water, sewer, electric, stubbed to your land, you don't even have to be hooked up to them. If they're stubbed to your land, if you are zoned anything other than ag, if you are, if you're in an area that's platted as a subdivision with 3 or more lots, those kinds of things. If you meet 2 of those criteria, they kick you off this assessment. They kick you off ag assessment, and they start assessing you as, something else, basically in town, single family, owner occupied, that kind of thing. What that can mean for these small producers, even though they're ag, even though they're producing food, even though they're meeting all the other qualifications, this bill would kick them off that. The Department of Revenue in the committee hearing said, okay, so you're a 5 acre truck farmer in Union County. That's way down in the southeast. Right now, because you're ag assessed, because you're a truck farmer and your principal use of your land is ag production, you're paying $175 a year for property taxes. And that's great, and that's low. And it's because you're ag. You get kicked off that under this bill, you're now paying $1,000 a year. So you go in a year from $175 a year to $1,000 a year in property taxes. Okay. That is an incredible leap. And for folks who are really focusing on, these folks are not making money hand over fist. And there's a lot of intensive work required. The reason that a lot of these small acre producers are close into their communities is because that's where their market is. So it, lowers the transportation costs, lowers the cost for things like, coolers and other equipment. You don't need a refrigerated truck. I mean, when I was a small producer, I had giant marine coolers, like the 102 quart coolers, to transport, my, tons of greens and, and different things that needed to be, kept cool. So this is going to be a huge hit for our small acreage local producers. And I think it's especially important to remember right now that, the pandemic really revealed a lot of supply chain issues, right? With food and with other, commodities that we rely on every day, toilet paper, of course, and other things. We need to be supporting these folks and not, just throwing them off. And the problem, further problem with this bill is, okay, it's going to affect a number of folks now, but it's a rolling wave, because basically, I look at this bill as basically an urban sprawl bill, right? Because as communities grow and those, the zoning classifications change, they move kind of further out, and as public utilities start to expand, you're going to see more and more of these small acreage producers kicked off ag. And through no fault of their own, because it's when you put that much time and effort and work into developing the intensive, production methods that these folks do, you can't just pick up and move to a different property and expect that you can maintain the same level of production. You can't. So, this is a really concerning bill for us. It was up on the House floor today. We beat it by one vote. It was 34 to 35 with one excused. So there was a motion to reconsider. It's going to be up on the House floor again tomorrow, and we are really motivating particularly local producers to reach out to legislators and their customers, right? If you are part of a CSA, or you go to the farmer's market, or you like to go to the farm stand on the edge of town, or, wherever else, this is an issue that is incredibly impactful and dangerous in terms of our local and regional food systems. And I just want to throw out too that there is a companion bill to this, which I think is going to get kind of much less play because it is probably pretty Black Hills specific, and that is House Bill 1149, which sets up a new class of taxation for folks who have small timberland enterprises. So they're basically small farmers who are working with, their tree farmers, their, timber and other, forest type materials that basically, creates a situation for them where they have to be, something like 160 acres to qualify. So these are really problematic, but like I said, House Bill 1085, it's up for reconsideration tomorrow on the House floor. And folks across the state are really concerned about this. Spearfish Valley.
Rebecca, real quick on the 1085, I just looked up the votes from it today because I wanted to see how our District 24 people voted on it. And they were both, Mortensen and Weisgram were both nays. So if I'm correct, we want them to be nay votes again, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's the other thing with some of these bills. It's okay, wait, which vote do we want?
I appreciate that. I know. And I was reaching out to people afterward and saying, okay, here's the vote roster. Anybody who voted no, tell them, say thank you and say, please vote the same way tomorrow. Anyone who voted yes, ask them to reconsider. And what was kind of disappointing to me, this bill really cut across some interesting party lines, because we had people from both parties on either side of this issue. One thing that I was really, disappointed about was some of the ag producers who spoke in favor of this bill and kind of punched down in terms of the small acreage producers. Like, hey, well, you're making so much money off your tomatoes. It's like, yeah, I got 7 acres and I got tomatoes, and you got 1,000 acres and you got corn. It's a different thing. But in this case, we should not be punching down on local producers. We all like, sweet corn and tomatoes in the summertime. And if we don't have a chance to grow them ourselves, we like that other people do.
Yeah. And, coming from being originally from Pennsylvania and doing, graduate work in diversified vegetable production, like there's a whole lot of agriculture beyond just corn and soybean and cattle. And one of the things with South Dakota is like working to develop some of those other specialty crops, and also not like shutting down the state, or not like shutting down those opportunities for South Dakota farmers. Because one of the things with climate change, as the climate changes in South Dakota, some of those crops might become even more viable and even more valuable in the state. And it seems funny for a state that, says we're all about agriculture, it's our number one industry, to say that, oh no, only a certain type of agriculture is, what we want people to be doing. So yeah, District 24 folks who are watching, definitely reach out to Mortensen and Wisegram and tell them thank you for their nay vote and to do it again.
Yeah, do it again. Do it again. Yeah, absolutely. And, the other piece of this, and something that folks have seemed kind of confused about on the bill, is that in any case, no matter how many acres you have, the total gross income you need to be to claim ag is $2,500 a year, $2,500. That's true if you have 240 acres. Okay. And it's true if you have 3. So like, I just look at that and I say, because I heard some testimony that was like, oh yeah, this $2,500 is ridiculous. And, and it's like, yeah, but that's still in there, and that's a different question. This bill is about, whether small producers who are held to the same standard in terms of income, gross income per year, as ginormous producers, like, why are we kicking those tiny guys off who are making the same, they have to make that threshold, so it seems like, yeah, there are some things here that are super out of whack, but this bill doesn't deal with them.
So we're almost to an hour, and I do want to talk about another bill, one more bill that is related to this topic in terms of local food economies, sustainable agriculture. And I also, for those of you in District 24, I just want to give out a plug. We do have a community supported agriculture here. You can buy a CSA share, and basically you subscribe and you get a basket of food from a local grower during growing season. And it's a great way to support a local business, really, and to kind of support that local agriculture in our community. It's a great way to lower your carbon footprint. There's just so many things about it that are really awesome. So please consider looking up and finding out if there's a local CSA in your community. And if there isn't, at the very least, find out where your close growers are and producers are that you can buy food from, including meat, because I understand. So that's actually a separate one, but I understand that there's been some legislation too, reconsidering this whole idea of like decentralizing the processing of meat. Again, a phenomenon that happened in the name of big ag, right? Like we're not going to allow kind of the local butcher to drive around and process, animals and then sell it locally. And we move to these massive meat packing production operations. And then COVID hits. I mean, and this has been going on for decades, right? But then COVID hits, and all of a sudden there's a huge bottleneck in that distribution chain. And suddenly people are having to kill these animals that couldn't be processed for food. And so suddenly then people are buying a pig from a local farmer and finding somebody to butcher for them, or learning how to butcher it themselves.
Yeah, right? What is this finding someone to butcher it for them? You just DIY it yourself.
So Rebecca, I'd like you to talk about the bill you mentioned earlier tonight before we went on air that deals with the value-added food pieces that I think tie in with this local food production part. Sure. And then you can kind of close with any other things that you feel like we should be, what are some other things we can do that are tangible in addition to advocating for legislation, but what are some other things we can do to support local food economies and to support clean drinking water and kind of just protecting the environment in South Dakota through our pocketbook and so on.
So and I've got 3.5 minutes. All right.
Oh, we can go over. It's okay.
Well, and I don't want to go too much over because I got to testify on a bill tomorrow morning. But actually I want to mention 2 bills, and one will be quick, and that is a good bill that is moving forward, and that we had a big lobbyist ag group hug on, I think last week. It all runs together, is that there's a small meat processors grant program bill that DRA supported, and that's about, it's a $5 million appropriation, which, is potentially not that much, but it's something to support some of the smaller meat processors in the state. And what I heard in that committee, which was super refreshing from all the ag groups and the commodity groups, was like, hey, we learned a lesson from the pandemic, about issues in our supply chain, and we really need to build up our local and regional food systems and, and our capacity, to produce and process food for ourselves. So that bill passed House Ag. It was a big group hug, went on to appropriations because it's it's a money bill. So, but I think that's going to go forward. So that's a really good bill. And thanks for putting the number up there because I couldn't have written down. But the other bill that's really interesting to us right now, and it was initially assigned to Commerce and Energy, and now it looks like it's in local government, is this House Bill 1121. And it's basically what's called a food freedom bill. So South Dakota has had for about 12 years now a home processed foods law, which basically was the law that meant that, the health department was going to raid your farmer's market because grannies were selling jellies and pies or bread or whatever else, or rolls. Dakota Rural Action actually worked on that. I worked on it as a member and as a small farmer and producer back in 2009, I think it was, to pass this home processed food law, or, in some places they're called pickle laws, that made it possible for people to sell some kinds of homemade, home canned, foods, at their farm stand, at their local farmers market, those kinds of places, as long as they were labeled and everything else. There were a number of qualifications. So, and some of them weren't great. Like, this was a process of, producers sitting down with the Department of Health, Department of Ag, and like hashing out a deal about like what we were going to get through the legislature, good old fashioned sausage making, but without meat, because that wasn't part of this bill. And so we've been operating under that for a number of years. There's been a few little tweaks. This bill is based on, this food freedom bill, 1121, is based on a similar bill from Wyoming, or law from Wyoming, and a couple of other states have passed it as well, which basically opens up, you know, a lot of the areas which were a little more restrictive. So like right now, in order to sell your jams, jellies, pickles, salsas, high acid canned goods, you know, or low water activity canned goods, at your farmer's market, you had to go through this process, third-party processing authority process, which was really kind of expensive and a pain in the ass. And I was a third-party processing authority. Like someone's got to test one of a batch, and like, you know, you have to pay them to do testing and stuff. And you know, the other thing is you couldn't sell anything that was like temperature controlled. You know, there were a number of, you know, things you couldn't do. This bill basically opens it up. There are some things you still can't do. Like you cannot sell low acid canned goods, like the things that cause botulism, your canned peas, any kind of canned meat, any kind of thing like that. You can't, no, you still can't sell that. But you could sell things like frozen chicken pot pies, you know, and other kinds of temperature controlled things, as long as you're selling them like directly to the end consumer. And you also can sell, you know, sort of, it opens up it a little more, gets rid of the third party processing authority, you know, piece, which was a pain in the ass. You know, so it does a lot of good things. My caveat here, DRA's caveat here, and I think it is a caveat here, is there's part of this bill that says that there's basically it's a local government preemption piece that says counties, townships, and municipalities cannot pass a more restrictive law. You know, it sounds great when it comes to local food, but then you start thinking about other ways in which our state government might preempt county, township, and local authority on things that they allow or don't allow. And that's where we start getting really nervous. So, you know, in the end, I mean, this is assigned to committee, you know, when it goes, probably we will be proponents of this bill. But as we, you know, said to, you know, the prime sponsor, I was on a call last night with some folks, including the prime sponsor, you know, talking about this bill. And, you know, we like this bill. We think, you know, it is, you know, it really opens things up. I mean, I think people probably have some safety concerns. There are some issues related to, you know, will farmers markets want to allow all these new things in? And, you know, there's going to be some adjustments, but I think overall it's probably a good bill. But I do not, you know, and we do not support the preemption of county, township, and municipal rulemaking, because we think that it can lead to, like down the road, it could lead to a lot of, you know, issues. And I don't necessarily always believe in slippery slopes, but this is one we've seen too often from our state government and this administration in particular. So we, you know, that's going to be a piece of it that we're going to have to call out.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in terms of just mass mandate and municipalities trying to do that and feeling like they couldn't do anything related to COVID, dating back almost a year now, without executive orders coming down from the governor. But the big one I think about is the plastic bill last year. That basically barred all municipalities, townships, whatever, from passing any laws related to regulating plastic waste, from, you know, like people throwing straws and things out their car windows to whatever. I mean, it just, yeah. So that, to me, I mean, that's kind of what I think about too. It's like it really kind of restricts communities that might be even more impacted by an issue in particular. And I'm not saying that there's going to be some massive public health crisis because these products are allowed to be sold in a market. I also think that's a great thing, but it is a little troubling to, you know, and I also wonder, like, is that language even needed? Mommy. Like, couldn't you just say, Mommy. just have a bill related specifically to adding these new items with less restriction in terms of health regulations, but then don't bother, like, why is there this kind of like, and don't you do this kind of thing? Don't think about doing this kind of deal. Although on a sidebar, then it'd be really cool if the state legislature said chickens were allowed in all, municipalities and that they couldn't vote against it.
Well, at least in Pierre. Or maybe we should preempt Pierre, everywhere but Pierre. No, I don't. No, and actually, those pieces of that bill would be really easy to amend out. The county township, the preemption piece would be really easy to amend. And and what I brought up with the sponsor of the bill and the other folks that were working on this bill last night was, have we seen this as an issue with our original home processed food? I mean, we've had over a decade to watch this and see how much of a problem has this been in terms of counties, townships, and municipalities, being more restrictive. Because I don't think it's been much of an issue. Maybe there's been a little bit of an issue here or there, but I think it's directly related to, some, particularities in, municipalities that weren't directly related to, like it was related to farmers markets and taxation or something like that, but it was not related to the actual products. And of course, farmers markets themselves, if you have a collective and you have an organized farmers market, you can set your own standards. You can say, we don't want X, Y, or Z. And then if people want to sell that thing, they can sell at a different market. But, that's really my argument. And that's the one that I'll make, in committee, is simply that this isn't needed. It's not been a problem with the other home processed foods law. And there's no reason for it to be in here now. Preemption is just, I just think it's bad practice, and dangerous to go down that road.
All right. Amanda, you have any closing questions or comments?
No, just to say thanks to Rebecca for all that you do for DRA and being sort of the voice on a lot of these bills and doing some really great outreach. I know as a DRA member that I get the legislative update emails. Is there a way for folks to get those emails if they're not a DRA member, or is that one of our membership perks?
So that is, getting the email is actually a perk of membership. However, you can read, there are a few things that we send out specifically to our members and within our committees related to action alerts or internal, just, super wonky good stuff. But otherwise you can read our weekly legislative updates on our website, dakotarural.org/news. I do post them there, and of course we share them to our Facebook page, Dakota Rural Action, on Facebook. And occasionally I get them over to Twitter if I'm thinking about it. So yeah, no, I appreciate it. I'd love to have, more folks as members, and I find our members are, the most amazing sources of, it's not just like, oh, you're an expert on an issue, so we want you to be a member. No, you're the expert of your own experience as a person in South Dakota, and that is also valuable. So love to have you. There's a lot of issues that we work on. Some are more glamorous than others, but we think they're all incredibly important to, our lives, our communities, our families, and, and our environment. So appreciate you having me for Super Wonky Couch Caucus.
Well, thank you for joining us. And if you are watching, be sure to scroll through the comments because we've put links to how you can join DRA, also link to the specific news update page for the organization, and links to all the bills that were discussed tonight are also in the comments. And I just joined while viewing. There's super handy. You can link it to your PayPal account if you have PayPal. So thank you again. And just a reminder that some of those bills are going to be heard tomorrow, as in February 5th. So if you're viewing this tonight, get into your email and start emailing committee members or your representatives related to the one that's going to be on the House floor. And we will see you next week. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bree. Thanks, Amanda. Have a good night.